Traditionally speaking, most companies have viewed customer support as a bit of a cost center. Now, with the evolution of AI and enhancement of AI, bringing AI into customer support is not a new idea, but can it actually help drive sustainable revenue growth? That's what we'll be exploring on this episode with James O'Brien. James, you are the COO of Ducky, an AI-powered customer platform. And if I understand this correctly, Ducky actually integrates with existing customer support tools in order to help your customer support teams perform better. Would that be a good way of putting it?
It's succinct and perfect.
Aside from the issue of traditionally viewing customer support as a cost center, implementing AI is an idea that, while sounds nice, actually has significant barriers. And I'd like to paint a bit of a picture for listeners here. According to Gartner, 87% of organizations have low business intelligence, BI, and analytics maturity, hindering effective AI implementation. A study by IBM found that 120 million workers in the world's 12 largest economies may need to be retrained due to AI and automation in the next 3 years. Deloitte's State of AI in the Enterprise survey revealed that 40% of companies cited high costs as a top concern in AI adoption. A PwC survey found that 84% of executives believe that AI-based decisions need to be explainable to be trusted. And McKinsey reports that 70% of change programs fail to achieve their goals, largely due to employee resistance. Quite a set of challenges there, James. And I'm curious, given the number of tools that exist in the whole customer support and customer success space, why dive into create Ducky? What was the initial premise as you saw it then, and has it changed a little bit since then?
Yeah, it's changed 4 times this morning, but I guess it's afternoon now. No, but in all seriousness, the original impetus for us to create Ducky, I'll take a little bit of a step back. I like to say to people that Ducky is a company that was built off of the promise of a relationship and not an idea. So my co-founder Hong and I actually met, and he was working on something totally different. And to his credit, I said, hey, I'm not convinced. Let's go validate this in the market. And pretty shortly, we were both like, okay, this isn't great. Let's go find something else to do. So by our process for doing that was essentially just ruthless validation in the market. So we went and we set up like 100+ interviews with people all across different lines and industries, different roles in business. And we just asked a number of questions. But one of them was like, what's your greatest pain at work? And I kid you not, Vinay, and I know this isn't how humans work, but 9.5 out of 10 people were like knowledge. It's a huge problem, right? We have so much knowledge. We have so much intelligence, quote unquote, within our business, but it's kept within disparate and disconnected systems. And then even though AI does exist and these tools do exist, BI tools do exist, the connectivity of these knowledge systems to BI tools and then actually extrapolating meaningful insights out of them is either something we don't do or it's something we're not doing properly. And I'll give a quick example here too. So one thing that's an industry standard within customer support is a concept referred to as the voice of the customer. And that's essentially a customer support and typically products team, and sales gets in there. Pretty much everybody gets in there, right? It's good to know what your customers are saying. But the industry standard for understanding this on, let's just say, a quarterly basis is to go cherry pick like 10 tickets, right? Like 10 customer conversations out of God knows, right? 40,000, 50,000, 10,000, doesn't really matter. Either way, I hope that illustrates that it's not a representative sample of enough data points to actually understand what people are saying. And then there's obvious like bias that's implicit there, right? Where a support team or somebody doesn't necessarily want to pick tickets that make them look really bad. So you read these 10 tickets once a quarter, you say, look, this is what everybody's saying about us. And then you're leaving a ton of stuff on the table. And in reality, customer support is really the greatest lens for validation and understanding what your customers are feeling, what they're saying, what they want, what they need, what they hate. But unless you can actually capture that in some sort of like digestible way, especially for other teams that might be tangentially connected to a customer support team, it's really hard to get that knowledge and transfer it elsewhere. So to wrap all the way back to the beginning, knowledge was the problem. Customer support was a place where knowledge was a big problem and where we understood, to the topic of your podcast specifically, it's not just a cost center. It's the greatest source of information about those that pay your business money, aka customers. And if you can actually collate those into meaningful understanding of what's going wrong, what's going, and what you could do even better, then it's actually a path towards better revenue and mitigate cost savings across the entire organization.
So correct me if I'm wrong here. It's just not just a platform meant for customer support teams. I would imagine that you're incorporating elements of BI in order to surface that knowledge, which would be useful to executives on the leadership team as well.
Yeah, so right now it very much is a customer support tool, and we have built some tooling, dashboarding for managers to understand individual performers, to understand trends, to understand ticket trends, problem type trends, things of that nature. At the moment, those are very readily shareable by screenshot, screen share, something of that nature. We haven't built any sort of the like dotted line connectivity, which is, hey, product team, this is exactly what you'll find interesting from our customer support data this week. But making sure that data is accessible and digestible by other teams who need to understand and know it is very much on the.
I'd love to unpack some of that. I was just looking over your bio and noticed that prior to Ducky, of course, you were crypto asset manager for Valkyrie Investments. During your tenure, you launched the United States' second Bitcoin futures ETF and grew it to over $1 billion assets. Before that, the first hired AI to IRA, a Nashville-based fintech specializing in self-directed IRAs for alternative asset investing, helped scale the business from pre-seed through Series A, growing the team from 2 to over 100 individuals while focusing on customer support, partnerships, and later crypto. But what really caught my eye was the fact that you moved to Nashville over a decade ago as a singer for a band and a piano player as well, all of which seems to me to indicate an entrepreneurial streak in you from early on. So I'm curious, when did you realize that you were an entrepreneur at heart?
This is a great question because it probably surprised me more than anybody else. I was, again, as you said, I moved here as a singer. To be clear, I only started playing piano about a year and a half ago, so I wouldn't call myself a keyboardist or a pianist, but I do like to dabble. And I had where I went to college and things of that nature, everybody had summer internships in consulting and finance, and I was very opinionated that wasn't for me. I was like, I'm a singer, I'm a creative, business is not something I really want to go into. And then I think like most of us, as we swim into our adult lives, we're like, pretty much anything you want to do involves some sort of business, right? If you want to be in a band, you need a way to accept money. Therefore, you need a registered business. And then you have to worry about the numbers, you have to worry about the operations and the booking and the internal communication and yada. So when we were in the band, I don't think I really realized that it was a quote unquote startup, but in retrospect, it very much feels that way. And it taught me a lot of the things that I still hold dear in terms of my knowledge about business and startups. But to answer your question more concretely, the way that I really got into startups and realized that I was quote unquote entrepreneurial was when my drummer told me that he'd been sharpening his razors on his jeans while we were driving through Illinois in the middle of the night. And I was like, that's not a thing. Turns out it was a thing. So we took that idea, which allows you to use denim to keep your razor blades useful for 3 to 5 times longer, which is way better for the environment rather than throwing them out all the time. And I worked with a local tailor in Nashville, who's a friend of mine, to create a prototype. And I brought that prototype to a bachelor party where I happened to meet my future business partners. And one of my business partners came from a very entrepreneurial family. He was the first one who invited me to recognize that I could do this and this was a viable career path. And it was okay to go find and follow a crazy idea and just keep pulling on it. So that Shave Face was our first foray into the concrete startup world. And I just fell in love. It was just like, it was creativity in a different way, right? Every day is problem solving. Every day is overcoming some sort of adversity. And there's really no high better than, oh, that was a problem and now I solved it, on to the next problem. Just like every single day, there's so many lows when you can't figure out a problem or it doesn't work out the way you wanted it to. But yeah, that's really what kind of got me into the whole world of startups.
And given your journey to date, by the way, I noticed you've raised 2.7 million in pre-seed, so congratulations on that. But in your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
Oh man, what a question. This is going to sound simple, but maybe I can make it a little less simple. I'm a people person. Cool. I think it's one of the reasons why I gravitated towards customer support, because if I can say this on a recorded podcast, I legitimately give a shit. I really want people to be happy. I want them to feel like somebody has their back. And even if it might be something that would otherwise feel like a faceless corporation. And then when I was running customer support for Alto IRA, that because we were such a small team, right? It was just two of us in the beginning and then a small team of 5 after a couple months, it became very apparent that the same avenue of customer support, like the people who were using our platform to invest, were also great individuals to structure partnerships with, right? They ran investment firms or they ran funds, and they were also trying to bring in retirement dollars to their funds and their firms. So it just was like a very logical next step of building relationships with people. And one of the reasons why I've always loved partnerships is because I think it's just a continuation of that same thesis, right? It's not necessarily pure play sales. I'm not selling something and asking you to pay me for it. And don't get me wrong, I understand that sales is also an exchange of benefit, right? You're paying me for something that provides benefit to you. But partnerships is just a little bit different a lot of the time. Like you're setting up a relationship where there's very often no money laid out up front. It's just like a resource allocation from both sides with the expectation that the other side is going to do what they said they would do and that you can trust them. Then the relationship will be mutually beneficial for both parties. And that kind of like codification, if you will, of partnership, trust, and mutual benefit is one of the things that really gets me up every day. It's how I handle life in general, right? Don't do something just because you expect to get something back. Just do it because helping people out has a tendency to pay dividends
Certainly.
at some point.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, if I were to ask you this question. In that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know, but should?
Specifically about me or specifically about
You being a people person and interpersonal relationships.
this is maybe a contested statement, but again, I think that people in general and businesses specifically, although I understand that time and resources are incredibly precious now more than ever, that I'm the one raising the money, accounting for every cent. But I think people need to always be very generous with their time and their expertise. Again, not always with the expectation that there will be a return on investment for that time, that advice, that moment spent in conversation with somebody. I would say that the greatest opportunities I've ever had in my life were because somebody trusted me and took a bet on me, even if my resume didn't say that I necessarily earned or deserved that opportunity. And on the flip side of that, most of the greatest things that have happened in my life in business have happened just because I or somebody else was very willing to hop on a call and be helpful however they could, even if there was no payback for it. Because people remember that. They remember who helped them to learn. They remember who is generous with their time. And then when they do need something that you might be able to help with down the line, you're usually the first person that they call. And I don't know, that's a big win. That's very satisfying for me. I think most of us in business and startups specifically are just lifelong learners. It's often said that in early stage startups, you're essentially being paid to learn for a living in the early days, right? Because you have to learn how to do something and then you have to learn how to understand if it's the right thing to do or if you need to go do something different. And everybody kind of shares that penchant for knowledge and learning. And they're usually trying to shortcut the process by speaking with people that they trust.
Very insightful. Thank you for that. At the beginning, I outlined a few issues around bringing AI into customer service, but from the many conversations you're having, what would you say are some of the more common misconceptions you're hearing?
Misconceptions, I think that's a very different question than problems. So I'll answer the question as it was asked, if that's cool. I think one of the biggest, I'll focus on two. The first is that customer support AI is designed to replace people, not support them. And I think that can be patently false. Now, don't get me wrong. Businesses all the time choose to fire people and employ chatbots or something of that nature. And that's all well and good if that's the strategy that you want to run. But in and of itself, like implicitly, the inclusion of AI or the adoption of AI does not mean the replacement of people, right? There are strategies that one can choose to embark upon where it is complementary and augmentative rather than based on replacement. And I'm biased because it's what we do, but giving people a quote unquote co-pilot, which is the hot term these days, to upskill them and help them do things better and faster, not only improves productivity for a team, because again, they're working better and they're working faster with higher quality data at their fingertips, or replacing certain workflows that were just manual and repetitive and can be taken over by AI. But it also really helps with team member happiness and participation, right? If you essentially go to somebody, you say, hey, yesterday you were a glorified data entry person, right? Like you were doing something thankless, or you were just answering the same boring tickets over and over. What if I told you that I can answer all those tickets or 30% of them autonomously for you, right? What are you going to do at that time? And that becomes a bit of a more philosophical question for businesses, which is, are you going to use that extra bandwidth to fire people and save money? Or are you going to think more towards what we were talking about earlier, which is if this is actually the bastion of all the great information that your business needs to know in order to succeed and make intelligent decisions, how are you going to employ those people strategically to actually make use of this information and to be more empathetic and spend more time touching base with customers and talking to people such that they think more positively about your business? And I have one more too, but I'll pause there in case you had any questions.
No, go ahead with the other one and then I'll ask you a question.
Okay, cool. I think the second biggest misconception right now that exists is, in customer support specifically, is there's just so many products out there in the customer support space. And as I'm sure you probably know and everybody can imagine, the incumbents, right, like the large customer support providers, most of them, not all of them, but were very early to roll out some sort of, and a lot of it wasn't great, right? So imagine you're a business, you already use a large ticketing system. You try their new AI functionality and it doesn't work and it's expensive. Now you're biased against the other tool comes down the pipe. So right now, one of the biggest misconceptions that I think a lot of the new entrants into the space, ourselves included, are coming up against is that people have already tried tech that let them down. Said very simply, that's not out of market. That's just how the tech is. It's where it's at. So I think one of the more important questions is to talk about other workflows, right? I can tackle that aren't necessarily generative in nature because they have a tendency to have higher fidelity than a lot of the generative capabilities that are out there today.
With the initial misconception you were talking about, would you say that stems also from this idea of thinking of the customer support as a bit of a cost center?
Definitely. And that's the philosophy that the entire industry needs to ask themselves about. It goes back to what we were talking about before, which is you've got these people right on your support team who have a better handle on how to talk to your customers, what they want, what they need, what they're saying, than pretty much anybody else in your business. But they're typically like on the lower side of compensation within your business, and they're seen as like very replaceable. But again, I think that's because of the nature of the repetitive work of just answering emails. And I don't mean to diminish that, right? A lot of customer support is actually very complicated and it requires you to understand every facet of the business and know where information lies. It's actually really hard. But again, because they tend to be on like the lower side of the compensation, people think of them as replaceable. And I think it's up to us. And hopefully this is where the industry goes, is that people can start to look at these people as strategists, because that's really what they are. They have an amazing amount of tribal knowledge in their brains. And if you stop thinking about support as a cost center and you start thinking about it as the hotbed of people who know your customer better than anybody, there's a lot of knowledge and like strategic insight that you can leverage there to actually make the business better as a whole and create into a profit driver and a strategy center, as opposed to just, hey, I got a bunch of people in a bunker somewhere answering emails, because it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, I would agree with that perspective. In fact, I would go so far as to say or suggest that customer support is really tied into customer experience, because beyond just answering what you're asked is the opportunity to actually create touch points that are meaningful to customers, which perhaps the rest of the organization doesn't have much bandwidth or perspective into. So that could certainly speak to actually driving revenue growth, and certainly retention being the easier one to solve for as well. I'm curious. So you suggested asking companies with the time savings that they have with perhaps introducing a chatbot or AI to customer support, what do you do with the extra time you've got? And I'm curious if you're having these sorts of conversations where you're able to help them see the bigger picture, not just viewing customer support as perhaps a revenue center, but also that of customer experience, and trying to provide data points that can speak to that, as well as empower the support teams to be more of a customer experience team as opposed to just waiting to answer questions.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two facets to it. One is the customer experience side of things that I'll touch on in a sec. And the other is, I don't really know how to state this, but I'll say it anecdotally, which is we make a habit of having pretty consistent feedback calls with our customers. And a part of that is always asking what sorts of information that they would love to be able to see that they can't currently see, or information that they would love to see that they have to go talk to their data team to grab, right? Giving them the tools at their fingertips to be able to understand things better without the help of another team. And one of the most frequently asked questions is to better understand the strength areas of individual people within their teams. And as an example here, let's just say that the data shows that I'm really great at handling upset customers, right? Like I have a high hit rate. I have a high success rate on turning a very angry customer around into somebody who stays with us for 3 years, right? It makes all the sense in the world to smart route those tickets to me instead of somebody else. Now, on the flip side, let's say I have somebody else on my support team who is very technical in nature, and they're really good at handling like nitty-gritty code questions that come in from developers. Now you can do all of the round robin ticket assignment and people get to grab the ones that make sense to them in the world, but it's just not a particularly efficient system, especially if you don't understand what I just said, right? If you can't definitively prove that James is great at this, Derek is really good at this, and then route those tickets accordingly. So understanding the problem agent match, I think, is really important and something that people ask for a lot. And then the other side of this one specific example is to also help people understand better how to upskill individual people, like specifically with new folks or contract support teams, right? If you can better see what problems they're struggling with, what things take them longer, or what don't have a positive CSAT score appended at the end of them, a lot of the time people just throw up their hands and they're like, this person doesn't perform well. But that's usually not true, right? People are normally pretty good at like at least one thing. And it's usually a lot more than one thing, but sometimes there's that one category that's like really challenging for them. So instead of firing them, going through a hiring process and ramping somebody else up, you can preserve all of that tribal knowledge and all that time that they spend onboarding and just work on one little thing, like work on one category where one of their peers can be like, hey, I'm really good at this. Can I help you get better at it? And that saves a lot of time and productivity for the organization as a whole, not just a customer support team.
With this idea of introducing AI to customer support, are there other issues that you see executive team members particularly interested in?
Yeah, I think, and this is harkens to the topic that you mentioned briefly, which is, I'll call it transforming. Right now, support and experience are typically bifurcated, right? Support is reactive and experience is proactive. I think with the advent of AI within support, we'll see those two teams meld and combine more in the future because support people will be able to do more relationship maintenance, which will then contribute to retention. And retention teams who typically sit under sales a lot of the time, not support, will actually be able to support their customers better, not just get in touch when there's an upsell or like just the bare minimum once a quarter to make sure that they don't leave them, right? Again, that was very like myopic. I know that it's a lot more nuanced than that. Teams do a lot more than that. But anyway, to answer your question specifically, what we see a lot is that executive team members are they're very laser focused on the metrics that have been set out, I think very often to their own detriment, right? So I'll give you an example. CSAT is customer satisfaction score is an industry term pretty much everybody measures. But simultaneously, pretty much everybody agrees that it's way more of a massaged art as a science, right? Like, most people in support know whether it's CSAT, whether it's NPS, like you don't send out those surveys to somebody who had a negative experience. You do send them out to somebody who had a positive experience, and you send it out as soon as the positive experience wraps up. So they're like, oh, great, this was awesome. Let me get that. Let me log that. So the metrics in and of themselves for most companies are like totally skewed. And a lot of that steers up because people want to prove that they're doing a good job. It makes sense. It's human, right? Like we're spending money on somebody, we're employed, we want to prove that we're doing a good job. And I think that actually trickles all the way up, if that's how trickling works, to executives, right? Like they have 3 metrics that they need to report to the board or they need to report to the CEO. And they're so laser focused on improving those metrics, very often at the detriment of like realistic operations and business strategy. Response time is a great one, right? Like we've talked to so many organizations who are like, response time is all we care about. And I'm like, okay. And so you want first response to be super fast, but you don't care if it takes 15 back and forths instead of 8. If I could tell you that you could double your first response time in a quote unquote bad way, right? Take it from 30 minutes to an hour, but your person has the time to dig into all the information, understand what's going on, send a very thoughtful response such that the customer responds one time, you get one more back and forth and it's resolved. Isn't that a better experience for everybody and a better conservation of your team's resources rather than just sprinting towards this 30-minute first touch time? So we see that a lot where I think people are focusing on the wrong metrics, almost in spite of themselves.
Interesting perspective there. I would have thought that being able to respond to a customer query as soon as possible is important. Even if it's an automated response, just to know that the query has been received and that
that's a contested concept of itself. I would go so far as to say that most support teams and customers are pretty tired of the automated, hey, we got your message, we'll be back to you response. Because most people are like, yeah, I know you got my email. I don't want that false hope 4 minutes later when I get the robot's response. It's, we'll be back to you. I would go so far as to say that if let's just play out an example here. If your SLA on first response is 30 minutes, take the first 27 minutes to see if you can start to solve it. And if you can't, then have an automated response or a person respond to be like, hey, Vinay, thank you so much for this. I need to dig into it a little bit more, but I will get back to you with a substantive response by blank. I would go so far as to say that nobody cares if a robot knows your email was received. They do care to know that somebody is on the other side actually giving it the time that it's due.
I would agree with that one.
I think it depends, right? If it's a kind of thing where it's like, hey, I need an answer to this 4 minutes ago, or else every server we have is going to burn to the ground. Like that's different. but for the most part, I think.
No, interesting concept there. I'm also curious. I don't know if you have encountered this in your conversations, but are there times when perhaps an AE or an account exec has taken issue with the fact that some of the questions that were answered by a support team they would have preferred to have had come through to them so that they could put their spin on it or perspective, etc. If so, how do you help people manage what is best answered by a customer support as opposed to an AE, etc.?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. It sheds light on the fact that those two teams are so connected at the hip, but again, they usually have slightly different goals. And don't get me wrong, the overarching goal for everybody is win customers, retain customers, make them happy. Like I get that. But for support, it's usually the very specific outcome of, I want to answer this question for this person. And very often support teams either don't have access to or don't have the time to understand the full context around a specific customer, right? Are they one of your largest customers? Are they accustomed to XYZ SLAs on response, yada, right? Very often it's an information and knowledge problem. But the other side of it is really like an operational and an arbitrage question, which is if you want to have a structure whereby anybody, just as an example, with a larger than $1 million ACV always goes through their E first, you can't rely on them to just always email their account executive. You cannot rely on them to always email the A, right? You can't rely on as a part of the process. You cannot put your process requirements on the customer. So if that's the case, you then need some system whereby, if let's just say James emails in as a $1 million VIP account, the account executive also needs to be copied on that automatically. And the support person needs to know that they are not supposed to respond until they huddle with the account executive. So again, it's a combination. I would say really it's another version of a knowledge problem. right? Like you need the right information at the right fingertips, and then you need to build those into the right processes automatically such that the edge cases do not throw you for a loop.
Interesting. I would have thought that it would always make sense to have all conversations, touch points with any customer recorded into your CRM or one source of truth, so to speak. So you can actually pull up data on what sort of queries are coming through, what sort of issues are they experiencing, etc. Because even as an AE, at least in my past experience, I was always curious to see the kinds of issues, the questions that were coming through, which would indicate the thinking within the organization and help me, if not just answer some of the support queries, but certainly speak to them in a strategic sort of way to help them with their operations and issues.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It's just not how it's always structured, right? If we think about HubSpot's a great example of this, right? HubSpot is a place where quote unquote all marketing communications and all customer support communications and a lot of sales communications all go into the same place. But that doesn't mean that the support team has access to the sales communications, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the salespeople have access to all the customer support records. And then I think we can probably all agree here that most account executives go back and forth with their customers via email. And now, obviously, I'm sure we all know that you can BCC any email communication into HubSpot, but that doesn't mean it gets done. And it also doesn't mean that the low-level support person who just got hired 2 weeks ago and is the first person to get assigned to this one customer communication, it doesn't mean they have the right permissions to see the account executive's email back and forth. So again, in theory, I'm totally there with you. And I think most companies would be, as long as it's not like a government contract or something of that nature where there's different levels of security clearance that are required for different communications. But again, we go back to the knowledge problem, which is just because the knowledge exists, the theoretical goal of syncing all of them into the same place so that people aren't duplicating work exists within an organization doesn't mean that the processes are set up or the systems are set up such that it actually becomes a reality.
Okay. It's a very interesting space. I'd certainly be keen to see how things develop. But I'm also interested in hearing how your experiences at Alt, IRA and marketing investments have colored your approach at Ducky in terms of scaling the company to what it is today.
Man, excellent question. I'll cherry pick like 2 lessons, one that I learned from each. So start by keeping in mind that Alto raised money and grew in a very different market environment where valuations were crazy and it was a lot easier to raise money. And I'm grateful to say that even in retrospect, like the business deserved to raise money, right? Like it did well, it served customers, it got customers. But the one thing that I really learned from being a part of Alto during a period of crazy growth, not just for the company, but like for the venture-backed economy in general, was the impact of scale and growth on team. I think we learned our lesson the hard way the first time when we hired later than we should have. And then we probably learned it the hard way on the flip side when we probably hired a little bit earlier than we needed to. Like you're always on this seesaw there. So one thing that I really learned from Alto was how to augment human beings with good process so that you could essentially wait until something is like very close to breaking before having to make commitment towards actually bringing somebody on. Because spending money is always a choice that one needs to make in business, but I think it's a very different caliber of choice when you're choosing to bring somebody on and essentially they're relying on you for their livelihood and their family. So that's one of those decisions that you can never make perfectly, but you always want to make sure you can make with the best data possible. And I learned that from watching Alto. I think we were very thoughtful about that, and it was a really good thing to be able to learn firsthand. And Valkyrie taught me a ton. It was wild, right? Like the business asset manager as a whole grew to like over $1 billion in assets in a short amount of time. We were one of the first to release a crypto ETF in a space where the regulation was like very tenuous around those things. It was super interesting. And it was my first time in quote unquote traditional finance, right? And I know crypto isn't traditional, but ETF and fund structures are traditional. I'll say I learned 2 things. One was the power of communications and marketing. Like we just had an incredible communications lead. And that was the first time where I was like, oh, PR actually does have ROI. Like being well positioned in Bloomberg and Cheddar and Yahoo Finance and all these places all the time was really one of the catalysts for growth for Valkyrie. And that was really fun to see done well, because I think we all probably are a little bit jaded when it comes to PR, right? You're like, where's the ROI on this going to be? And I saw it firsthand, and it was really fun to see that done well. And then the second thing that I think I learned at Valkyrie was that the same skills that are required to do customer support or customer experience in a B2C fintech company, the same foundations apply to investor relations within asset management. They are your customers, just it's different. The terminology is different. The stakes are probably maybe a little bit higher, but the same tenets of just being available, picking up the phone when people call, being prompt in your communication. Again, even if the answer is, I don't know right now, but I will figure this out for you. Really, you're only as good as your word, especially if it's a very small team and they need to know that like they have a person they can depend on. And I was very heartened to see that those same philosophical maxims, if you will, which are not really customer support maxims, right? Like they're just the type of person you want to be. Do you want to be reliable? Do you want to be honest? Do you want to be helpful? Those things really matter. I would go so far as to say that those really matter regardless of the end.
With hiring people, are you looking for a particular indicator within the organization to let you know you've hit the limit and the only way to perhaps grow is, or to meet demand is to hire another individual?
It totally depends on the problem at hand, right? Sometimes the answer is just upgrade your tech
Sure.
systems, upgrade your operational processes and automations. It really just takes a very honest look at what sort of work. I'll just give a quick example, right? I was like drowning in SDR work because I was hopping on the calls, scheduling the calls, taking the transcript, going and sending it over to our CRM. I was just like, and someone's like, you should hire an SDR. And I was like, oh, so I started looking at that. And then I realized I was like, it's not a bandwidth problem. It's a process problem, right? I can sync all these things up automatically to schedule a call, have the transcript automatically send via relay over to our CRM. And then all of a sudden I'm saving myself 15 hours a week in the SDR work. In that regard, that wasn't something that I felt like required human expertise to do. It was just something that they were operational processes that could be refined. In my mind, there's two types of hires, right? One is just to take work off of your plate. And those are the ones that, to my previous comment, like I try to look at operational efficiency before I look at bringing on somebody, because very often you can just build a new process for it. The other is when you really feel like your team is missing something, when you feel like they're missing expertise or they're missing some sort of joie de vivre, like culturally, that like you don't. Those things I don't think can be augmented by process. And the way that we discern that is, are we working on something new and none of us know how to do it? We've now spent 10 to 15 conversations trying to get smart on this, but it's really just taking a ton of time. And my co-founder likes to say it best. He's like, yeah, sure, I can code front end. He's like, but it's going to take me 40 hours to somebody else's 8. And that's one thing. And then you also can look at the delta of how much time and energy have I spent trying to get good at this thing, when in reality, I should just be honest with myself that like, it's not my thing. I'm not going to get good at it. I could get good at it, but it's not the highest and best use of my time. And by bringing on somebody else who is already great at it, not only will we accomplish the job that needs to be done, but I'm sure we will all learn a ton more, and we'll have another like strategic and senior voice in the room who can guide us towards it, right? It's the age old, like you never want to be the smartest person in the room, or else you're in the wrong room or you're an egomaniac.
Certainly. And with PR, given the nature of the organization, I can understand why things like Bloomberg and Yahoo Finance, etc., would make sense. But in order to ensure that you're receiving an ROI, I'd be curious, because quite often it's hard to see a direct correlation between content and sales or even lead generation, because there's usually multiple touch points before someone that actually comes into your pipeline, so to speak. What piqued your interest in observing how PR was done at Valkyrie?
One, it was so universal and constant. Ryan, who was our head of comms, the chief comms officer, was just like in the team's Slack channel every day was 3 or 4 opportunities for speaking. And he would always be updating us on what he was doing, right? Because like PR is usually a black box and you get these opportunities, you don't really know how they came about. And Ryan just did such a great job. He was also like on the executive team with us too. We got to hear his updates. We got to hear what he was doing. And he did such a great job of always slacking everybody essentially. And so as a result of that, I got to see third hand, but how many calls he was making, how many people he was pitching, and then the opportunities that those were creating. And now, and to your previous point, right, like ROI correlation in any marketing is challenging. And there's a million tips and tricks, UTM links and all this stuff. How'd you hear of us? Those only work to a certain degree. Asset management is a little bit different because very often it can be like a binary game. Like you can spend just, I don't know, I'll just throw numbers in the air, but you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars doing PR in a year, get no return. And then on month 11, you can get somebody to come in and invest $1 billion. And then all of a sudden, all the money you spent is worth it. And we would get individuals calling us, asking about our products and willing to contribute money and invest money without really ever having known the team before. So that was a strong indicator. And then even more like when we had public vehicles, when we had ETFs, that marketing is no longer just to individuals who want to invest. It's also toward financial advisors who are looking for a trustworthy source to. One of my good friends is in asset management. He's in wholesaling. And he always says that a lot of what you need to do to arm your financial advisors or your RAs with is so that they have something new and fun to talk about at a cocktail party, or when one of their customers asks them about crypto, which is most of the time now, they have not only a thesis built around it. And as an asset manager, part of your job is to help them build that thesis, but then it's also to have a product that they can point somebody to so that they have somebody for that.
Right. Given your pre-seed round, what would you say would be your biggest insight as a result of the process you've gone through?
Of the fundraising process for pre-seed? Man, what a question. So many learnings. I'll say I'm not great. I've learned about myself. I'm not great at artificially creating FOMO, which is one thing that everybody always tells you to do. If I do say so myself, I tend to be pretty forthright and spinning a yarn so that people falsely think you're better or like further along than you are, or you've got more interest than you have. It's just not something that I really vibe with. So I'm trying to get better at FOMO, but in a genuine, not in a disingenuous way. And then the other thing I'll say is, and to be clear, like I've been a part of a lot of fundraising in my life, but I've never been the one in the fundraising seat for myself when it pertains to like raising institutional capital. I'd only raised angel and friends and family capital for my previous startup. So what everybody says about volume and pace is really important. Like you need to run fundraising like a sales process. You need to set time bounds for yourself in which you're going to send out XYZ number of emails and you're going to tell people this is the timeline that I'm trying to keep on. And you need to run a very regimented process, or else if you let it drag on, it will. And obviously there's a bunch of other nuance in there, right? If you just don't have an idea that people are really enjoying, that's another reason that it can drag on. But if you have something promising, you have a decent business or a decent business idea, depending on your stage, you have promising co-founders, like it really is about creating a good and regimented process and cashing in on every network you possibly have, asking for introductions, cold emailing, cold calling, like people do respond, especially in the VC side of things, not always. And then the last thing I'll say is the concept of gradually, then suddenly. Like we were out there fundraising for a little bit. It didn't take too long, I'm grateful to say, but a little bit. And then we got a lead and we got our other 2 follow-on institutional checks within 4 weeks. And those happened within 3 days of one another. If you keep at it and the idea is worthwhile and it's presented adequately, like it will happen, but it's easy to get super disheartened along the way. So just keep plugging. But also be honest with yourself along the way, right? Like sometimes there are signs where you're like, this just isn't going to work and we need to do something a little bit differently in order to have this.
So given you're a people person, personally speaking, the fact that you are now involved with Ducky in order to support customer support teams, how do you view empathy as being a key element in supporting clients and customer support folk? Are you trying to help, perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, people become more empathetic to the people that they serve? And if so, what does it look like now and into the future?
Yeah, definitely. That's probably one of my number one goals in life across the board, whether it's business or not. And I think I'll relate this to sales first, which is really good sales is not shoving something down somebody's throat, right? Like you're not trying to convince them of your way of seeing the world. You're trying to understand very quickly by listening. Is there a world in which like what we do and what makes sense? And very often it's not going to be a perfect fit. There's going to be some custom development. There's going to be some problem solving. But, unless you actually go in with it, well, I don't remember who said this, but it's one of my favorite quotes, which is you need to listen, not listen to respond. I think in my mind, that's really like empathy in a nutshell, is listen for the sake of listening and then do your best to understand where the other person is coming from. Try to like truly understand what's going on and what their needs are. And I think that methodology for sales also trickles down to customer support. And it's a little bit different for us in customer support, only because I think most support people are very empathetic to begin with. That's why they gravitate towards that style of work. But the sheer number of correspondences that they have to answer in a day, or again, the fact that the information they need is in 17 different tabs and they live this like really complicated, disorganized existence, not by their own fault, it gets in the way of that, right? It means that very often, like you do the one job, which is respond to the email, and then you don't have any time until you move on to the next thing. So our hope is that by making a lot of those time-intensive processes automated, or at least more automatic than they are right now, people will be able to take that step and empathetic and listen, problem solve, troubleshoot, and just take the extra time to help people understand that like you've got somebody in your camp on the other side of that computer who's not just checking in and checking out, but they actually care about solving your problem, care about it.
Is there a particular focus though in I guess the evolution of Ducky with regards to empathy?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think it probably looks something like there's pretty, and I don't mean to sound super flippant with this, but sentiment analysis is pretty easy to do with AI. It's not a complicated thing. You could go grab an open source library and literally put it in like a day. So I don't think it's as simple as sentiment analysis, right? Is this person? I think it has a lot more to do with, I'll botch this a little bit. There was, God, they got acquired. Anyway, there was a company years ago that made their business off of, hey, can I look at Vinay and can I look at his LinkedIn? Can I look at his Twitter? Can I look at his Facebook? Can I look at Google? And can I like better understand who this person is, right? Like, how do they like to be communicated with? What are the things that matter to them? Might have been Clearbit. And anyway, some version of that, which is like not, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like, hey, does he have 3 kids and does he live in Menlo Park? It's more like, for everything we know about the way he uses our product and the way that he's communicated with our teams in the past, what are certain things that we need to be aware of that might like trigger him to think back towards a previous poor experience, or something that might make him feel like this is a continuation of a previously really wonderful communication. So it's like the AI's ability to go through and pull out summarization or like quick hits of things. It's, hey, you need to know these 3 things. And if possible, you should work these 3 things into the conversation, because it's just, you see somebody, you haven't seen them for a year, you remember their name and you remember their kids' names, right? Like that matters. Yeah. Like it tells people that you care and that you listened the first time. Things that can replicate that kind of like emotional feeling where nobody's going to remember the thousands of people they email with, especially because the email is going to be like waterbottle4@gmail.com. But it's like, if we can pull out those things that actually not just make people feel like there is a human connection, but make both people feel the human connection. Like, I think that's where everybody is happier and more fulfilled in these relationships.
I look forward to it. And the last couple of questions before we wrap up. In the space of viewing customer support as a revenue center as opposed to cost center, do you say that there are perhaps a couple of areas that don't get talked about very much or don't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
Don't get much airtime. The biggest one that I see is probably internal to teams, and it's burnout. It's burnout and emotional exhaustion, because very often support people are just getting yelled at digitally, like and sometimes not digitally, right? Like sometimes it's phone calls, and that's exhausting in and of itself. And don't get me wrong, like customer support leaders are very attuned to this and they really care. But as you go further up, like the executive chain, nobody really knows what that feels like if they're not actually in the ticket queue or taking customer calls. So it becomes very hard to empathize with that concept. So it's something that we talk and like struggle with, right? Because it's if your only buyer was the customer support manager, right? Like they would probably spend money to make sure their team was happier because it lowers churn on employee churn, it increases productivity because people are happier, it increases customer outcomes because people are happier corresponding with customers. There's noticeable ROI to that, but it sounds very fluffy when you try to pitch it up to a budget holder. So that I think is one of the things that is overlooked quite a bit and something that we're endeavoring to do something about, which is if we can put concrete data around team happiness improvement, right? Lessening burnout, then there's an actual ROI to our previous conversation around including those sorts of features within a product and having an organization pay for them.
Yeah, very interesting. If listeners and those watching are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Man, I'm in so many places. Please feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. As they say, the DMs are open. Also, please feel free to head to our website, Ducky, DUCKY.ai. There's a contact form there. There's a couple ways to get in touch with us, including our general email. Please feel free to get in touch in any way that makes sense to you. And we would love.
We'll include links to that in the show notes. James, thank you so much for doing this. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Vinay. It was very fun to do this, and I really appreciate you having me on.